Absolutely superb so far, and that is going to continue. Claire and I are going to give a double-handed presentation, WITs to Wags, or Wags to WITs, wives and girlfriends to women in IT. Oh, indeed, indeed. And then we're going to have prayer at the end. So, without further ado, I'm going to introduce my colleague, Claire Priestley, who's going to talk about women in IT and diversity in IT.
Diversity, thank you. Good morning. Good morning. How many people have been to a conference in the last 12 months other than this one? Quite a lot of you. How many of you have been to a session on diversity at those conferences? Okay, so quite a few. So what I'm not going to talk about are things like the lack of diversity in product testing, for example, where facial recognition software hasn't picked up different skin tones, or indeed hand soap dispensers and that sort of thing. Because we're largely in operational IT, and I think that's what I'd like to focus on, the issues that face us, the challenges that face us in university running IT functions. What would you say is the most important commodity, for want of a better word, that we have enabling us to run our functions? What's the most precious thing we have, precious asset we have? People, exactly. So I'd like to concentrate on that. And I want to share a figure with you to start with, 1,482,000. That is the size of the UK IT job market as of 2016, the end of 2016. Conservative estimates forecast that that's going to increase by 800,000. Some say 1 million, some say 800,000, and that's by 2020. So in less than 2 years, that job market will grow. And we know that only 17%, shockingly, 16 to 17% for the last 10 years of those jobs were taken by women. Even more worrying than that, frankly it's really not good enough, is that we don't have the figures for racial diversity, for example. The BCS report you saw flash up just there comes very close to it. It's a great report. Please check it out. It tells you a lot of information about diversity in IT, but still not those figures. What we do know is that around about 28,000 people are graduating in computer science related degrees every single year. This was last year's figures. And whilst we know that our source of people isn't necessarily going to be computer science related degrees, it gives us some indication as to the volume of traffic we've got coming into the industry. So, you don't need to be a mathematician to work out that we are facing a recruitment crisis by 2020. And we're competing with pretty much every organisation across the UK for our talents. And I would suggest that it's our ability to attract, recruit and retain really good quality people that enables us to continue to deliver really good operations for our UK universities. It's not just us that is facing that recruitment crisis though, and if we look to the private sector we can see what people are doing about it. We've got the likes of Ernst Young who have lifted the criteria for degrees. They don't even need people to have A-levels in order to be applicable or to make applications to join them. They get even more creative, using things like Tinder, for example, to target Gen Z and millennials. And similarly, GE are using social media that's applicable to the kind of people they're looking to recruit. So we have to start getting creative about how we target, how we attract, how we retain our people. And to just take us a bit further and look at the UK university sector specifically, Heidi looked at sent out some research to all of you.
So really I should have backflipped across the stage then. We found we couldn't do that one. Okay, so when Claire and I decided we were going to do this presentation, one of the things we thought was important was to actually have some data about gender equality. So I focused specifically on gender equality in IT departments in universities. And I sent out a survey to all of the UCISA list. I'll tell you a little bit about the responses, but the first thing I wanted to say was I made a number of boo-boos with this survey. I definitely got my terms wrong. So I put in terms which are mainly about having a binary gender, I used all sorts of vocabulary that was wrong. And a number of people pulled me up on that, and I was mortified to have made such a boo-boo. But it's just more to acknowledge that and say, if anybody is looking to do some research in this area, to be really careful, make sure that you've spoken to somebody. So I should have gone and spoken to our Equality and Diversity Office, for example. So that was one of my big learning points around this, was that you have to think in a different way. So I just wanted to acknowledge that first of all. Okay, so sent out the survey to the whole UCISA list, and I had 126 responses from 53 institutions. The reason there are multiple 126 responses in 53 institutions is that some institutions were extremely keen. I actually asked people to send it on, send it round their departments, which they did. And some institutions, so I think the University of Nottingham, I had about 10 responses from them, which was absolutely fabulous. So again, thank you for those who responded. So the 53, just a little bit of an overview of who those people were. Predominantly Russell Group universities, but a mix of everybody else. So I feel we've got a representative picture of institutions in the sector. A little bit biased towards Russell Group, but those are the figures. By gender, not quite 50-50, but again, not too bad in that it, given the dominance of men in IT departments generally, we've actually got quite a lot of women responding to the survey, so about 40% of people who responded to the survey were women. And then you can see the bits in the middle there, and this is where I got my vocabulary wrong, around binary gender divides, etc. But noted those on the slide as well. Okay, I asked a question about, are you concerned about gender diversity in your IT department? Because I thought that was a good place to start. People might actually not be that interested in this. Delighted to say that 80% of people were concerned about the gender balance in the IT department, but it's also worth saying that 11% of people weren't. And there were another 9% of people who were had no real opinion on that. So lots of us are concerned about this, but not everybody, so that's worth noting. Why were people concerned? So I said, if you've answered yes about concern, why are you concerned? What bothers you about the fact that you haven't got a balance of gender in your IT department? And there were groups of responses there which I've tried to pull together, and when I was rehearsing this morning, I was thinking, oh my God, what did I mean by that? So I'm going to talk through what I think. So there was a big group that was around the whole imbalance in the IT sector, that it's mainly about men, a male-dominated pool of people who are going for jobs, taking up the profession. There was a bit about the culture being very male-dominated, so they're concerned about the fact that it was difficult to move it on because the culture was very male-dominated. And then there was also a group, the 10% there, that were interested in difference. They didn't want to have, there was a quote from somebody that I'd actually read online which reflected one of the responses that we'd had that almost said, I want the IT department to be representative of the people who are in the population. So there was a bit about getting that difference or getting similarity really right. A few quotes here, and these were very interesting. So yeah, and I can definitely identify with this. Worked in a sector for 20 years, and sometimes I'm often in meetings the only woman in the room. And that's obviously borne out by people at different levels in the organisation. This I thought was quite an interesting quote, in that IT is portrayed as very male-dominated, but actually there's quite a lot of women work in the IT profession, and we need to start changing that perception. And I was reminded of, there was the film about the ladies who did the maths for the Apollo launch. And again, these sort of people get almost written out of history and forgotten, and I thought that reflected that too. And then, so almost a statement of the obvious, but this was borne out by the data as well. Very few female developers, and even fewer work in infrastructure. I asked then questions about what is the overall gender balance in the department overall. So these are the figures, and I just asked people for an approximation really. And the average here was that there were 77% male, 23% female. Then in senior management, now what's interesting about these figures is that actually reflects what we got in the beginning. So across the department you've got basically 80-20. Senior management team, same sort of figures. And then I asked a level up again in leadership, and again about 80-20. Now this actually gave me a warm glow in some ways. I know that the figures are very skewed, but it did actually show that there was progression. So that, you weren't just stuck at the bottom. It wasn't just, so if you look at some professions, so for example in academia, the number of female professors is very, very small, but the number of female lecturers is much, much higher. Whereas here we seem to have got, people are moving up the ranks dependent on their gender. So that made me feel positive message. I asked then, which areas of your IT function do you have the best gender balance? And I don't think it will be any surprise to you that 43% of people said that the best gender balance was in project and program management. So that seems to be, again, that feels right from observation. And the least balance was in security and infrastructure. And the figures are here, actually. So some areas really have very, very few women working in them at all. So security and infrastructure. So these are averaged figures about what people said. And some other areas, yeah, and again, these felt about right to me from observation. Okay, I then asked some questions about what have you got at institutional level and at departmental level to support gender equality and diversity more generally? And here's what people said. So this is the question. So, does your institution have any policies to encourage women in IT? So, institutionally there were things, about half, but the IT department didn't have anything in particular in addition to that. Which, was I surprised about that? No, I don't think I was. In fact, I was surprised that it was only 57% said that, as in 43% do. So I thought that was interesting. Policies to encourage diversity. This is what people talked about and said they had at institutional and departmental level. So one of the things that came out loud and clear in all of this was that Athena Swan has had a big impact across the institution. So those of you aware of that it started off in science, Athena Swan, about getting more women into the STEM subjects, and has now been extended across the whole of the institution. And they're also talking, and my institution has been taking this a little bit further forward, about looking at Athena Swan for support departments as well. So that's very interesting that at an institutional level, Athena Swan seems to have had a big impact. And then equality and diversity offices, and something that's being championed from the top of the institution. And definitely at the University of York, that's something we've been very keen on. Then at departmental level, people are starting to do some work with their HR departments, identifying, what we can do in terms of recruitment. So I felt there was some good messages, blind applications, and Claire's going to talk a little bit more about what she's been doing at City later on in this regard, but also from what she was just saying, there is work going on in the sector more generally, or outside of HE, around having recruitment policies and approaches that encourage women into IT. So it was good to see some of those in HE as well. I asked a question about if you felt you'd been discriminated because of your gender, and again I felt, although there was some high numbers here, in some ways I was pleased about this. So I'm not sure if you can read that well, but the green is in the IT professional generally about having experienced discrimination, and the yellow is in your current institution. So you can actually see that in the universities we seem to be doing better than the outside world, which I thought was a positive thing, although it's still upsetting that 11% of people said they have experienced some sort of discrimination. I asked then, if you have experienced discrimination, did your institution help you have things in place? And the response to this question is the one that, it sounds a very weird thing to say, but it was very gendered, this response. So if you were a man and you'd experienced discrimination, you either said that your institution had things to help you or it didn't. So you were very clear. It was either yes or no. If you look at the response from women, they said no or yes, or I'm not sure if the institution has anything in place. And I thought that was very interesting in the way that women respond to these questions. In some ways, the idea was that, well, I might have missed it. There might have been some support, but I wasn't aware of it. whereas the male response was very much yes or no. And I don't know whether that's just a, I don't know why that response, but it was so striking, the difference there, that I just wanted to highlight that. Okay, I then asked about positive initiatives, so what's actually worked. So there are initiatives, but what things have you actually found to work to improve gender balance? And at institutional level, again, Athena Swan came out very, I mean, some of these are almost what we're doing, what they've said the institution was doing, but these were things that they'd picked out as positive things, addressing the gender pay gap, and I think most people will be aware that we all have to publish our gender pay gap statistics. I think before the end of this month. There's a lot of work going on. So there are things going on at institutional level to improve gender balance. This is a quote from somebody. So what surprised me about this was that this was seen as sort of new and different, the idea of having a woman on interview panel. Surely that's one of the things we should be having anyway, but good to see that people were noting it. Application process being anonymous as well. And I was talking to somebody at the conference, Steve from York St John, and he was saying he's been working with a company where the application process is entirely blind up until very, very far along the line, so that you first of all do your interview process via something like Slack, where you've no idea, you just ask questions. And I thought that was very interesting about getting that, not in HE. I'm not aware of any examples in HE, but maybe Claire will correct me, but just really people thinking this one through very far back. And then at departmental initiative, lots and lots of stress there on the culture of the organisation, job adverts using language which was neutral language, and having senior management playing a much more prominent role in some of these recruitment things. And then there was a quote, again, and I thought this set the scene really well, about culture and leadership, you know, what the message comes from the top about this. So line managers lead and develop a culture of tolerance and non-discriminatory language in the workplace and support flexible working practices. So I thought that was a great example of the sorts of things we need to do as leaders to change this. So key messages. It's around the sector and the profession, it's around the roles that are available, how we talk about them in recruitment, and then it's about the culture. However, just to step down one, this was also a quote from the survey, the problem starts much, much before you ever start to recruit. And I think Claire's going to talk about some of that. You know, it's this 9% of people who do computing A-level are women. You know, there's all sorts of things that stop people even getting to the process of application. So I think, for diversity's sake, we need to think differently, and Claire's going to tell us how her institution's been doing some of that different thinking.
Oh, lower your expectations. I'm not going to tell you how. Thank you. Just to, as I say, manage your expectations. What we've been doing isn't different, it's not innovative, it's not radical at all, but it is systematic, and we've looked at plugging as many gaps in this long and leaky pipeline, as Melinda Gates described it, as we possibly can. And everybody I've spoken to, including people that have worked on Athena Swan initiatives, including people that have worked on broader culture change initiatives, agree that actually it's the aggregate of the many small initiatives that will drive change, particularly culture change. So I won't go through all of the initiatives, and in fact these aren't all of the initiatives, but I'll pick out a couple, and if anybody wants to talk to me afterwards about getting some ideas about other things that they can do. These are just some of the activities that we went about doing. We took the long and leaky pipeline and we split it into primary school, secondary school, student and within university activities. Clearly this is the stuff that influences us. This is within the workplace, within my IT function and within my university. And then we also looked at beyond the university, so that people started to get ideas about where they could get to, what options were out there. So some of the things that we've done, I'll just pick out a couple from each of these. I called for a team of volunteers. I said, let's have lunch, you bring it. I'm not paying. come to lunch, let's just brainstorm some ideas. If you've got a passion for enhancing diversity, improving diversity in IT. And a coalition of the willing was formed from within my team. Men and women, and really energized, enthusiastic people. And we built on that and we said, what can we do? What can we do at each of these stages? So at primary school, we've got a couple just in the local area to City, University of London. And we went out to the teachers there and said, would you welcome us coming in and talking about technology, doing some sort of practical work with tech? And we developed a 4-module approach where we took apart computers and reassembled them. We built a network. We made a film and then brought them into the Green Room studios to look at how that was edited and projected. And it was fantastic, received really well. We then went to work with some STEM Girls initiatives across South and South West London, 4 different senior schools, and I sent ambassadors, role models, into each of those schools to talk about their careers in tech, and actually from my broader network, engineers and scientists, and in fact some of the lecturers from within the university. So that was before people even get there, and that talks exactly to the point that Heidi made. People make a decision way before school, before university rather, about whether or not they have an interest in STEM subjects. And we can do lots to influence that. I have to say, this particular initiative here was one of the most energizing for my own team I've ever seen. When you see a 9-year-old talking about an artificial limb that they've built using Lego, the excitement is palpable and it carries back into the workforce. It's a really great thing to see. I also talked to the Dean of our School of Mathematics, Engineering and Computer Science. We have lots and lots of technology, we have lots of engineering tools and equipment, lots of fun exercises that we use within the university, as I'm sure many of you do. And most of the time they stay locked away in a cupboard, except for the one module that they're needed. So we brokered an agreement with the STEM Girls initiatives, with some of the schools, to start sharing some of that equipment, to start generating excitement across each of those different boundaries. What else did we do? We have role model lunches. We get people like Heidi, for example. We get people that are leaders in their various different fields, artificial intelligence, robotics, chief data officers, chief digital officers. We get them along to come and talk to my team and students and anybody who wants to come about their career journeys. Role models are really important in creating change. That's what I hear from everybody. And then within the department, what did I do? First of all, I said, we will, as standard, have a policy that says we will promote internally before we look outside. Now, clearly that comes with complexity, and there are some exceptions that need to be managed, but we start with that premise in mind. What else have we done? We've signed up to the Tech Talent Charter. If you don't know about the Tech Talent Charter, please Google it, go and find out. It's really simple, and it creates a statement about your university. So lots of initiatives, and I'll tell you a bit more about some of the other ones in a second, CIO +1 and so on. Some of the key lessons, coalition of the willing I've mentioned, take the energy that's already there and go with it. Do what you can. So Heidi tells me that within York, actually, racial diversity is a bit of a problem in terms of just getting a shortlisted pool of applicants. So go for gender diversity. If that's the pool of applicants that you can only pull from, that's what to look for. Design out bias. We've talked about how you can do blind recruitment, but there's a tool called Textio that you can see up there that will completely debias any adverts before they even go out, just automatically process it. And there's a number of other things that you can do underpinned with policy. And I'll come back to the demonstrate with data, but it's really important. It's really important that we start to baseline all of our data and then demonstrate the difference that our efforts are making. So I said that I got lots of role models in, and you may wonder how I find these people. Anybody recognise this place? It is the Shard, yeah, it's Aqua Shard, a restaurant at the Shard. And as IT leaders, we get invited to lots and lots of really good quality networking events. And this was the first one I ever went to. So 22 months ago, when I took up this role, I actually recruited from internally quite an inexperienced senior management team. And as a result of that, I knew I had to build out my network really quickly. And this was the first event that I went to do that. It was a CISO-CIO summit, and I walked into this place, very glamorous, very, very wonderful, and as is the case, I'm afraid, I walked into a sea of white, middle-aged, middle-class men. And no disrespect to this demographic, clearly, but it's a pattern that we'll see continue. I was talking to the table of 8 people, and these were global CISOs. And I asked them about diversity, and they immediately said, oh, I've got women on my team. In fact, I've got one woman promoted on my team. Actually, I was talking about millennials, because to me, for CISOs, that was a bit of an opportunity. And I was astonished that none of them actually had even thought about getting millennials or Gen Zs onto their team. When in fact, this could be my prejudice, but this was the guy I was thinking of at the time. And the point there is we've all got blind spots. We need to actively unpick our thinking if we're going to make change, because we don't know our blind spots. It's the Rumsfeld theory. So I continued going to these network events, 2, 3 a month. I put on weight clearly, because eating good dinners and all that sort of stuff. But every time I walked into a networking event, my heart sank a little bit more, because it was the same picture. And just incidentally, I did an interview recently for CIO, and the journalist quoted me as saying, every time I walked into a networking event, my heart beat a little more as I saw the sea of white, middle-aged, middle-class men. What's even more disturbing is that journalist graduated from City. So I got to the stage where I just wanted to walk into a networking event that represented the streets that I was walking in from. And the only way that I could think of doing that was to make my own, essentially. So I came up with the concept of CIO plus one. It's a really simple concept. Like me, it's not complicated in any way. The plus one is me asking you, as CIO and IT leaders across IT, clearly across IT, to look within your own workforce and to spot somebody that's got a bit of talent that comes from a non-traditional group in terms of IT leadership. Now that could mean anybody. You know, neurodiversity, racial diversity, gender diversity, somebody that is not necessarily your typical CIO. Come along to the events, they're high caliber. I've taken basically everything that I loved about the good events and everything that and kept it, and everything that I didn't like about the poor events, and I've got rid of those. So there's no selling at the events, although I will give props to a sponsor, and in fact I am looking for sponsorship, shameless plug. No selling, but there is great networking, high quality speakers, and they seem to be pretty successful. We've had amazing speakers. Theo Blackwell, who you heard mention of on Wednesday, is actually due to be the keynote speaker at the April event. But you'll see there Maggie Adirin-Pocock, a guy called Rohit Talwar, who is a futurist with a complete brain the size of a planet, and a number of other speakers who I'm sure you'll recognise. And I think one of the markers of whether or not something is successful is whether or not people copy it. And sure enough, this appeared in my Twitter feed a couple of weeks ago. But actually, there's a serious point to this. The plus one concept it's not new. You know, this is about shadowing. It's about taking somebody from within your team and taking them into your exco meeting. It's about pairing somebody up with somebody who's doing a job in a different area and getting them exposure to that kind of condition, to that kind of conversation, and to that kind of network. It's highly transferable. I talked earlier about data, whether or not we'd baselined it, whether or not we'd measured it, and I think the results are speaking for themselves in terms of what we've done. This is in 22 months what we've managed to achieve at City, and as I say, this is just from lots and lots of little things. Pretty much all I've got to say. Thank you very much. Thank you.
We just give a round of applause.
Thank you.
So I'm now in the rather weird position of chairing the session that I've spoken in, so forgive me there. But have we got any questions from anybody? So for either Claire or me. Yep, Anna.
Claire, I wondered if you could say a bit more about neurodiversity.
About neurodiversity,
Yeah.
sure. So one of there's a number of different aspects from my perspective. I think we're all familiar with Belbin's team types. We all understand the principles of getting, lots of different styles of thinking within our team makeups to get really rounded performance. And where we've identified we've got gaps in those areas, compensating in some other way, or at least being aware of it so that we recognise there may be blind spots as we've talked about before. But actually there are organisations doing some really incredible things around neurodiversity. There's a company called Autism Works who has identified the transferability of the skills of people, high-performing Asperger's sort of syndrome people, in relation to technology. So they've created this direct feed of people going from, or coming from their organisation into testing and coding careers. Lots of opportunities for that sort of thinking.
In relation to neurodiversity within our sector.
Can you ask me the same question in a different way? I'm not quite sure I've grasped it.
So my experience, I suppose, is that actually we work amongst people who are very neurodiverse. And,
yes.
And what that means for us, for UCISA perhaps, and what it means for promoting, kind of giving that same level that we're giving to sort of perhaps gender parity to neurodiversity.
Yeah, well, I think diversity is a completely untapped subject. Really, we can see just by we're still at 17% for gender diversity. If we even we haven't even scratched the surface for many other things, it's a really difficult argument. We talked about this at City in relation to the Athena Swan initiative. Should we really be focused purely on gender diversity? What about racial diversity? What about neurodiversity? And I think whilst we have very clear KPIs for gender, that's not at the exclusion of other things, but the very nature of focus is that it will take you somewhere. It will help you progress. And I think what we decided actively to do from a university perspective is to focus on one thing, nail that essentially, and then start to look at unfolding other things.
Thanks.
Welcome.
Any other questions? Yep, several down the front here. Yep.
Hi, good morning.
Hi, Sam.
Hi there. Congratulations on the presentation. I think it's really, really interesting material, thought-provoking and challenging to kind of question one's own assumptions about how we think about people and their capabilities and skills. I wanted, though, to perhaps challenge a bit what appears to be an assumption. The assumption that if there are less of a particular gender in a particular profession, it's because they've been stopped. I wanted to question that assumption and push back a challenge that maybe less of that gender are interested. I know lots and lots and lots of females of all ages, and I can't think of how too many who are really interested in infrastructure and networking. I can't think of many. So that would seem to be consistent with the numbers of females who work in infrastructure and networking. So I'm just challenging a little bit the assumption that a lower number means that they're being stopped, and maybe it just reflects a lack of interest.
Well, I think that's a very, very interesting question, but I would say that what experience has shown that people have had not a lot of interest in certain subjects because they've seen it as being the preserve of a different group. So there haven't been role models there, so it's not that they haven't got interest, they've just thought, I'm not going to succeed in that.
So could I challenge the data behind that statement. Is there any data that
So
supports the statement?
medicine is one of those areas that used to be male preserve,
Yeah.
absolute male preserve, and now it's more women in medicine than there are men.
Well, I would suggest that
And it's
isn't-
role model,
I
and
would
it's the
suggest that that's not
availability of the training.
Yeah, I would suggest that that's not necessarily empirical data which can be rolled out across every profession. For example, if you look at the nannying profession, the care working profession,
Yep.
there are many professions that there is a predominance of one gender in the profession. My wife works in a primary school.
Yep.
The vast majority of primary school teachers at her school are female.
Yep.
I don't know how too many men who are interested in caring for small children and young children. So I don't know. I
I've
don't
had
know too many.
an audible intake of breath, and
As a
somebody's waving up
As a
there,
profession.
desperate to come
As a
in.
profession,
Yeah, yeah.
I don't know too many men
So
who
what I-
think.
so
I don't
what
know
I-
too many men who think, you know, I'd really like to work in the nannying or the childcare profession, but I'm just questioning that we need to be careful that we don't put across an assumption which doesn't really have data support. The lack of numbers means they're being stopped.
There's somebody waving to me
Yeah.
at the back here who wants to respond.
Can I just,
because
can I
like the-
just interject at that stage
Yeah.
as well? So, I mean, I think it's a really valid point, because the last thing that we want to do is to ostracize anybody in the bid to make our industry a rich and successful and appropriate profession to be in. I don't think the word stopped was ever used. I don't think that is the case personally. I don't think there are active blockers. We're going to come and talk to Sharif in 1 second. But there is evidence to say that decisions are made by school girls at school age, between the age of 9 and 14, that actively change their course in relation to STEM subjects.
Yeah, so, and I just wanted to follow up on that, and you know, I do love data. And so one of the things that I didn't get a chance to talk about before, but that we did work with our assistant dean in the College of Engineering, was we were looking at retention of women and underrepresented minorities in engineering specifically. And very, very long story, very, very short, we're able to identify the point in the curriculum at which we saw those specific demographics drop out. And they were dropping out in the first semester of their second year of school, and we were able to identify that was the point in time at which programming was introduced into the curriculum. And so we stopped and had a conversation about it, and really programming is just taking what you know already and automating it, yeah? And what we found is those specific groups just needed a little bit more confidence in the fundamentals, and by shifting the introduction of programming to the second semester, so our retention rates in those demographics go through the roof. So I don't think it's necessarily a lack of desire, it's just what's the environment, the learning environment in which these folks are operating.
And we've got another,
Got another couple actually.
yeah, this number of people, okay, yeah. Sorry, gentleman here, yeah.
It's Darren here from Regent's University. A very good talk, both of you. Thank you very much. If you can just indulge me for a few moments, I'll just give you a very, very short case study. I had a big problem a couple of jobs ago trying to get women into my IT team. We kept going out, there was no one in the pool. So we looked again at the job itself. So what we did to this was we changed the job slightly. Mm-hmm. So we asked for, and I don't want to sound patronising in any way, but we asked for a first line person that would take calls coming in from students, from staff, and from outside. And all I wanted was someone with good customer service skills. And we said, if you're interested in pursuing a more technical career, once you join us, we will take you into the infrastructure team. So essentially we would get them to shadow and have opportunities once they're in the role. And I have to say it worked really well. So it might just be in that it won't work all the time. They won't necessarily, but who knows? They may. What I was trying to do was bring them in and encourage them to try out new things that perhaps they wouldn't have considered. And the other thing, Claire, at the bottom of your slide there, it says flexible working. And again, if I think the majority of the women I have in my IT team, nearly all of them are either term time only, or they're working, say, 3 or 4 days a week. And again, I do think there is a risk of an assumption. You can't be a CIO, you can't be a senior manager unless you're full-time. And I would like to challenge that, because I think for some of us, men and women, we would quite like not to work 5 days a week if we could possibly help it.
Yep. David, and then we're going to have to wrap up, I think, because I think this debate could run and run and run.
Yeah, I think it needs to run and run and run, because it's a great debate.
Thank you for that. Yeah.
I'm David Telford from Edinburgh University. I have a 50-50 gender split in my team. And some of that took a bit of work. And I'm really worried by some facts around this, because I am the white, middle-class, grey-haired old guy. And I've been concerned about how I present myself in the industry and the words and the language that I use. And I'm going to upset the empiricist, because I'm a social scientist. And that means I work on qualitative rather than quantitative data. And some very basic qualitative data worked for me. Jennifer Moxey, my head of infrastructure, networking and security, when I approached her and said, not only do I think you would make a great network engineer, I think you can lead the team, she completely fell out with me about it. Thought I'd chosen the wrong person, didn't understand what I was talking about. And I persuaded her to have a look at this, because I didn't look at her as a woman in technology. I saw the skills that I wanted in that team. That was it. Just gender blind. I just looked at the skills. And I persuaded her that this was something to look at. And I got worried about that, because I thought, why am I having to work so hard at this? And what I arrived at was, there was a confidence problem here, because Jennifer Moxey is now far more passionate about networking and security than I am, and is a shining light in my department. And so I think we need to be careful about challenging data and challenging thinking, and taking some of the challenge out of it, and seeing that there are problems that old, white, grey-haired, middle management men like me can overcome by simply recognizing that people have skills but might not have the confidence and need a little extra support in order to get that confidence in the role. So I would encourage all of us who look like me to rise to that, and to see the skills and the potential and the leadership in these people, regardless of their gender or their even their neurodiversity, as Anna said, and simply look at those skills and develop those skills, and don't be put off by somebody's underconfidence to be understandably a bit concerned about being involved in what is predominantly a male environment.
Okay, thank you, David. I think we should bring this to a close. Thank you very much for your participation. I think this is a debate we need to return to. Lots of interesting questions, and I'm sure there'll be more to come. So thank you very much. So.